Hello, I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn.
Your Teagasc Sustainability Advisors, and you're welcome to the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, bringing you the latest information, science and opinion to improve farm sustainability.
On this episode, Teagasc Dairy Advisor in Kilkenny, Pat Moylan, chats to us about the importance of being ready for the silage season and the value of slurry in reducing chemical fertiliser use.
Silage effluent is a highly polluting liquid and can cause fish kills in rivers and contaminate wells if not collected, stored and land spread correctly. With up to 30 litres of effluent lost per day from a tonne of fresh cut grass, what can we do to avoid losses?
With a cold, dry start to the year, a lot of grass is waiting to be cut for silage. Why is it so important to test the grass for nitrates and sugars before mowing?
Is slurry really just a waste product or something much more? Pat tells us how Teagasc Waterford Kilkenny Advisory Region are working with farmers on a project to improve slurry use efficiency and reduce the use of chemical nitrogen on the farm.
With silage season beginning, I asked Pat, what should farmers be doing now to get their silage pits ready for harvest?
Look, at this stage with the silage season imminent, it's time to look at the silage pit itself, to examine the silage pit, look at what silage has been left over. Is there any waste or rotting silage around the edges need to be tidied up, and maybe with a shear grab to get a kind of close shave or a tight finish to the front of the pit. After that, it's time to examine the structure of the walls and floors, looking for cracks, hairline cracks, etc. And if some repairs need to be done with hot bitumen or asphalt, or maybe a 3-to-1 sand cement mix, now it's time to get them ready. And after that, I suppose it's really to be organising the tyres and the potential what you're going to use for recovering. So now is the time, because once the silage season starts with contractors, it can start very rapidly. And next thing, it's all a rush job, and farmers are just find themselves under a lot of pressure. So there's a bit of time now. The weather has improved. Hopefully, a bit of growth is coming, and silage season is approaching. So look at the pit and get it ready.
Yeah, looking from the water quality side of the house, I suppose we'd be worried about effluent getting into the rivers, and look, generally farms will have a drain or some connection to a river, so it's vitally important we keep that effluent away. And Pat, where would we be normally channeling the effluent, I suppose, into slurry tanks?
Yes, in the majority of cases, I suppose silage effluent is being channeled into slurry effluent tanks. So I suppose it's about time that people will check the channels, that they're going the right directions, that the diversion traps are working correctly. And, you know, it's not very good practice generally to spread raw silage effluent onto the land, as you know, because it can burn the grassland. So it's preferred that it is stored in an adjoining slatted tank. But again, you need to check that all that plumbing, if you like, is effective, and that the diversion traps are working to make sure the effluent goes where it should go.
Yeah, and I've seen that actually on a few farms on where effluent is so potent, put on land, it's like you sprayed it with Roundup, it just completely burns it. So it's, even just to give you an idea, we're talking, I think, per tonne of grass, you're talking up to 30 litres of effluent can come off it when you're in silent first. So just to consider that. Just another thing there, Pat, I suppose we're talking about cracks there and bitumen, you're talking about sealing. Often you'd see these little cracks, and I've come across it a few times, where the crack comes down the pit, goes into the ground somewhere and comes up somewhere else on the farm. They're fairly hard to trace, so even those little hairline cracks are important to cover, aren't they?
No, absolutely. Look, if it's a question that the silage effluent going down somewhere on the pit floor and coming up somewhere else around the farmyard, well, that's a major job, which at this stage is, you know, people have to put some temporary measures, maybe by putting double row of plastic or a sheet of 1,000 gauge plastic underneath the silage for this silage season. But really, that really lends itself to a whole, you know, digging up and putting in a new whole silage base there. And as you know, you need at least 28 to 30 days drying time with modern concrete to ensure that it's good enough come harvest time. So that's a job that at this stage is probably too late, but obviously it's something that is of urgent importance. So I suppose my recommendation would be to put it, maybe one if not two sheets of 1,000 gauge plastic, for example, on top of the existing slab, and bring it up along the sidewalls for now, if you think that is the case. And obviously then you're going to be looking at next February or March, when the pit is empty, to do a proper job. And maybe it might lend itself to applying to TAMS. TAMS does cover the resurfacing of existing silage pits. And at this stage, all concrete work is done with 45 Newton 20 concrete, but timing is of the essence.
Yeah, and we'll go back a little bit now, I suppose, thinking of when we closed off the silage paddocks. This is an unusual year, and I know we were chatting about before I came on there, but it's been a cold year. It's been dry enough as well, so growth is back a good bit. It's actually unusually for this time of year, the growth is really poor compared to what it was other years. But thinking when we're putting on our 100 units of nitrogen maybe and our P's and K's to get ready for the silage crop maybe 6 weeks ago or whatever it was. Do you think there's a fear maybe that there could be nitrogen still around, or what would you advise?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our recommendation for first cut silage has always been around 100 units of nitrogen per acre, including that which comes from the slurry component of things. And I suppose most farmers would have put out, in my estimation, somewhere around probably 80 units of chemical nitrogen this year, and the balance through slurry using the low emission slurry spreading techniques. We normally talk about 2 units of nitrogen being used up per day, but we know that this April just gone has been the coldest and the driest April in living memory. And I would believe there's a lot of background nitrogen still there. So look, we know the weather's a bit milder this week, and we have rainfall, and there's every chance that growth will take off in the coming week or two. But this year might be a very good year for farmers to be ultra cautious near harvest time, to get the nitrates tested on the grass and the sugars to be sure, because high nitrates and low sugars is a pure disaster as regards silage preservation. And I'm sure with the COVID situation across the country, all the different Teagasc offices have a protocol or will have a protocol in place for people to leave grass samples, preferably frozen, and leave them in a box maybe outside the office, clearly labelled. And then we will bring those in due course and test them for both nitrates and sugars, and ring or text the farmer back and tell them what the situation is. But obviously, yes, go back to the original part of your question, Cathal. This year with the slow growth in April, is it going to be a very high risk situation for high nitrates in silage? And we'll have to look at mitigation strategies, whether that be letting the crop grow on longer in most cases, or if we do decide to cut, we may be looking at putting in some form of, to use wilting, for example, or else use some kind of preservation agent to aid the conversion of the sugars into lactic acid.
Yeah, would you be advising them, Pat, that every farmer really should be getting that silage tested before they cut?
Well, I think yes. I suppose what we would like to do in the office, particularly in Kilkenny Waterford area, is when the samples come in, we will actually try and maybe organise and text out once a week what the nitrates and sugar are like for most farmers. Myself, suppose particularly, I always pay more attention to the sugars. You would like sugars to be at 3% and greater. But farmers themselves will have a fair idea by looking at the crop. If it's very lush, low cover, bluey green colour, and maybe not so long closed, they'll have a fair idea themselves that the nitrates cannot be low enough for preservation. And obviously the weather will dictate too what will happen in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So look, the whole thing can change very quickly in the grassland world, as I mentioned earlier, particularly now with a bit of rain at the weekend and milder temperatures. But yes, I suppose if you took even one sample on the silage fields, it would give you a guideline of where you are at this present time even.
Would you reckon, say, if you do come in with high nitrates, obviously that's a bad thing, that we either overapplied nitrogen, or like you said, the weather that we had this year, just the growth wasn't there to take it up. So we have excess nitrogen sitting up in the leaf, and it's going to affect our ensiling. But I suppose at that stage, your advice would be, if you do cut and it comes in as maybe high nitrates, low sugar, would you kind of cut maybe in the evening time and give it a day's wilt or something like that?
Yeah, it's always best practice if you can to cut maybe the grass in the afternoon when sugars are at their highest point. And I suppose the other thing would be important that the crop is actually cut dry, because it's not as easy to dry a crop if it's cut actually some way wet or cut very early in the morning or late at night, which ultimately can happen, obviously. So the first step would be trying to cut it in the afternoon. And then obviously, depending on the weather, if you really want to get wilting underway, to till out the grass straight away at cutting time. I kind of find some years that farmers cut the grass, it's in wide swaths with modern machinery, and what they think is wilting is not actually wilting at all. And if they want to increase the speed of wilting, my advice has always been the day you cut it, you should till it out immediately for full ground cover. Leave it a day and a half, having a close eye on the weather, but you will get the sugars up and the dry matter up a lot quicker if you do a full tedding out of the grass after cutting.
I suppose optimum cutting time is dictated to, I suppose, by the contractor. But I suppose the testing and the analysis that we do in the offices gives you some scope in the management decisions after the cutting as well. Pat, once the pit is open in the winter, how can we stop the rainwater running into the effluent channels and filling up our tanks?
Well, I suppose the first thing is that obviously we want to keep the silage pit face fairly clean, and that's why our advice has always been for wide, not for wide silage pits, but for long and narrow silage pits particularly. And then to make sure that the channels are working. I suppose in the modern design of silage pits now, it is strongly advised to have a double channel at the front of the silage pit, even before the pit is opened, that the clean water goes actually over the plastic onto the outside channel and goes away to the clean water drain, and the effluent is on the inside channel at the front. So that's a kind of, I suppose, a design factor. But I suppose other than that, then it's going to be important that the pit face is kept clean and the base, the apron, as you empty the pit. So a lot of what's coming off the silage pit is totally dictated by management. If it's dirty, well, then you're dealing with water that must be collected as if it's a slurry. But if you keep it clean, that can be directed to the clean water drain outlet. But look, it's a lot of us doing with management and having the correct channels in place, making sure the channels don't get clogged over the winter period, and managing on a day-to-day basis, like any soil yard.
But the perimeter channels, I suppose, also it would be very, very important to make sure that the ensiled grass should never extend over the channels, and the plastic as well over the winter period, shouldn't it?
Absolutely, I suppose that, and that's that's why we generally talk about having a silage pit apron at least 6 meters out from the first channel, with another channel at the end of that to allow for that circumstance. But the ideal world, you have the rainwater fall on the plastic coming down and coming into the second channel at the front of the apron, while the effluent is being caught by the fourth channel. That's what you'd like to aim for when you're designing a silage pit, and those specifications are available on the department website there.
Yeah, because it's easy to be caught out there if you're cutting silage there and you bring it in and you're trying to squeeze a bit too much into the one pit. We've seen it a few times, and particularly if it's a bit of a bumper year for grass, where that pit is going a little bit beyond the channel and just nearly leaking down the yard all winter. We have to kind of avoid that at all costs.
Yes, that's why the advice has always been, when you look at the design there, specification from the department, that you do one of two things. One, you have a second channel which is at least 6 meters from the first channel, or else you have a slope from the front of the apron back towards the channel where the silage is. If you don't have a second channel, that way there'll be no escape of liquids from the base of the concrete.
Yeah, and if I had a magic wand, and you don't see it in too many farms, but talking about pit design there, you're talking about, we would often see, or on paper, if you could do it, that if you could fill the pit from one side and empty it from the other side, so that when you pull back the plastic over the winter, that all that rainwater from the plastic is going away from the pit rather than into the channel.
Yeah, I suppose, as you said there, Cathal, that's the ideal situation, but that mightn't pertain. A lot of silage pits are generally filled and empty from the one in my experience. So it comes down to the management and keeping keeping all the rotting, any bits of rotten silage that are falling on the floor off the front loader, keeping that area as clean as possible and making that yard as clean as you can.
So a lot of silage is being baled these days throughout the growing season. How do we ensure that we harvest good quality bales, and what's the best way, do you think, Pat, to store these, particularly with water quality in mind?
Yeah, I suppose obviously in the early season bales, there haven't been too many to date, but that could all change again in the next week, 10 days. And typically these farmers are cutting maybe covers of maybe 2,000 to 2,500 covers of green lush grass. So obviously cutting it in the afternoon, obviously giving it a head and having it as dry as possible. And when those bales in particular are made, again, I'd say ideally they should be stored in a separate part of the yard, maybe for now no more than one bale high. Because like you've said there, I've seen it there where people have made bales in April and May, and next thing they put one, if not two bales more on top of them very quickly, and next thing there's leaks all over the yard and the bales are really flattened to pancakes. So particularly this time of the year, April into early May, before the fibre really comes into the grass plant, those bales should be kind of, if they can, made separately and even marked and kept for early lactation feeding next year. I know some farms will go as far as either putting a different cover of plastic on them at this time of the year to identify them, or else mark them fairly clearly. But they are high quality. It is high quality material in those bales, but people have to be very careful about the way they store them and not to put more than one bale on top of them, being honest about it.
Yeah, I suppose stackability is also influenced by, the dry matter content. So at around 25 to 35%, you can stack it around the too high and try and go on their ends rather than on their rounds, because once they're on their rounds, they tend to be pierced, especially if you try to put two, one on top of the other, you get bursting and mold growth and that as well. So it's important to look at the dry matter content when you're storing them as well.
And if you do come across them, I suppose oftentimes you could have 50 or 100 bales sitting in the yard and not being collected, and you don't have to collect them if they're not leaking. But if you do come across a leak, generally, I don't know you, Pat, I don't know if you're coming across the same thing. I try and get them to take out the leaky bales and stick them somewhere with a bit of channel on the end of a silage bit or on a dung pad or somewhere they can collect.
Absolutely, Cathal, yeah. Maybe a lot of cases the manure pit for storing for FYM is empty now, and the dung has been brought to the field storage, so that would be an ideal place to put in those type bales, or obviously the corner of the existing silage pit inside the channels, to be sure.
And they need to be 20 metres away from the watercourse if they're not, stored in a yard with, and the effluent going to a tank. So you need to keep that 20 metres. It's very important from the water bodies.
Any drains or anything, yeah. Pat, the Waterford Kilkenny region, the advisory region you're working in, you're doing a bit of work with farmers to improve the efficiency of slurry there over the last few months. It's very interesting. I know myself and Deirdre are involved in a bit there as well. But can you tell me a bit about it on the slurry side, what you're doing with farmers there?
Yeah, this spring, I suppose, in a bid to reduce chemical nitrogen use on farms, and also for farmers to apply the appropriate amount of nutrients, and particularly to the first and second cut silage. I engaged with a number of my discussion groups, and I know other advisors did the same, and we got them to take slurry samples, which were sent away for analysis, and I suppose those analyses came back there in around the first week of April, just in time for us to make appropriate recommendations for first cut silage. So I suppose over 30 samples from 3 discussion groups of mine, what I suppose I found of the average dry matter was around 6.6%, with a range of maybe 2% dry matter for open tanks, or indeed slurry lagoons, and up as far as in one case, I think we had 10% dry matter, which came from a slatted shed that was used for fattening cattle, completely covered. And from an NP and K point of view, the average analysis came back at 6 units of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons, 5 units of phosphorus, and what surprises is that we got 40 units of potash per 1,000 gallons on average, whereas heretofore our book value would have said maybe 30 units of potash. So we came back with, I suppose, the equivalent of a 6,540 fertilizer, and each farmer got his own and the group results, and then they went back and made appropriate adjustments to their fertilizer program. So it's definitely well worthwhile, and it can still be done at any part of the year with agitated slurry. And it gave those farmers, I suppose, a definitive figure for their own yards, what material they're dealing with. And obviously then if that slurry was then applied with less or low emissions slurry spreading equipment, well, that 6 units of nitrogen might be as far as 9, maybe 10, maybe 11 units, depending on the time of day and the spreading technique. So look, that was the key message, that they saw the dry matter, and the dry matter has a huge effect on the NP and K, particularly the P and K.
That's it's interesting actually, because if farmers are used to doing soil testing. I think everyone is happy enough to spend a few pounds on soil testing, and we see the benefit in it. But it's not that common, Pat, I'd say, for people to test slurry, and it's something that we would certainly be pushing, because it's only 50. It's about €50, I think. Is it for a sample or something?
€75 including, 75. Yeah, €75 is the agreed figure.
So if you only need a couple of tanks, the main thing there is to make sure it's well agitated. It's a good representative sample. And once you have that piece of information, now you have a whole slurry tank of compound fertilizer. In my eyes, you're after saying whatever 630, 40 or
6540.
6540, sorry, 6540. So if you went to buy that in the co-op in a compound, you're going to be paying €400 or maybe $450 a ton for it. So I think it really opens our eyes up to seeing, that slurry tank it's like a little bank vault there. It's definitely not a waste product, and we have to mind it and utilize it.
No, absolutely. I think farmers are seeing this spring with the increased cost of chemical fertilizer, and also we have to be cognizant of what's happening maybe in the region, southeast region, with nitrogen and phosphate levels. and like bit by bit, and I think a lot of good work was done over the winter period by our derogation courses done by Teagasc nationwide. And I think farmers are more aware of what's happening on farm, and that there are places that they can cut back on chemical fertilizer application without affecting growth. The other parts of this is many projects happening across Kilkenny Waterford on 3 farms, that during the months of May, June, July, they're also spreading 2 rates of chemical nitrogen on the grazing paddocks, one rate 20% below the other. And these guys are measuring grass on a weekly basis, so they're going to come back and report to us what they've seen. So it's a little kind of a mini program here in the Kilkenny Waterford area, with the ultimate aim of reducing chemical nitrogen use, but also the first part of that for those farmers is getting their slurries analysed. So look, there'll be a lot of good messages from it, but definitely I think we're all realising, and we need to realise that this slurry, particularly now we have more covered tanks than uncovered tanks, and meal field levels are what they are on beef and dairy farms. So this is a valuable nutrient on our farm, which costs money to put there. It's not a free fertilizer by any means, but we do need, and farmers need to take more, I suppose, cognizance of it going forward, and ultimately they can reduce their fertilizer bills.
Yeah, I think it's a great program down in the region, because we're aware the southeast region has some issues with nitrate, because we're in free drain soils, and kind of leading ahead trying to find practical measures and show farmers how I suppose to reduce their nitrogen inputs, but also try and maintain their growth. So I think definitely the farmers we visit like to be able to go onto farms and talk to other farmers and see how things are going. So I think it's the right step. And I know you're calling it the 3 T's down in the region is test your soil, test your slurry, and test your silage, see what the quality is like. So I think that's a good point to farmers.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent management tool with environmental and financial benefits to it. Do you have any advice, Pat, on spreading of slurry after the silage is cut?
Yeah, so for most farmers, there will be a reasonable quantity of slurry to be spread because of the delayed spring growth, as we mentioned earlier. And I suppose our normal recommendations would be obviously to agitate that slurry very safely, number one, because there is evidence to suggest that when the air temperature increases, that we can actually have increased levels of hydrogen sulfide emissions. So to be very careful at agitation points, and not to be in the vicinity of the shed, and to have it all the doors wide open and get away from there. That'd be the first thing, safety message. And secondly, our normal recommendation would be in the 1,500 gallons to 2,000 gallons of agitated slurry per acre, and ideally it will be applied straight onto the aftermath of the first cut silage, and then people will have a chance maybe a week later to come back in with the chemical nitrogen. Like our standard recommendation would be probably 80 units of nitrogen in total from all sources for the second cut, maybe around 12 units of phosphorus and 80 units of potash. And for most farmers, that can be by and large met by applying 1,500 to 2,000 gallons of slurry, and then using something like maybe protected urea to bring up the nitrogen to the total of 80 units in total. So, the slurry has a huge role to play as part of the P&K fertilizer part of the second cut, but it must be handled very carefully, as I mentioned.
There's one thing to think about there, actually, just jumped to my mind. We spoke about that it's likely that there's nitrogen not utilised because of weather. Like, geez, we had frost there the other day even here. It's unbelievable. It's been very, very dry around the southeast as well. So obviously that nitrogen is sitting there, and generally after we have a dry time, once that heat comes, we'll have mineralisation of nitrogen, and the 100 units that probably weren't utilised from the first cut. So just to bear that in mind when people are throwing maybe nitrogen and slurry on for the second cut, that there's probably excess nitrogen in the soil there to be utilised. So it's definitely a good point to think about.
And actually maybe to call their scope there, maybe to cut that recommendation back by up to 20 units per acre to allow for all that, because we've seen it from a great situation that over Bank Holiday weekend a couple of years ago, I remember we farmers were recording 130 to 140 kilos of grass dry matter per hectare per day because of a background nitrogen. So look, we have better slurry out there on farms with a cold spring, and the fertilizers you mentioned is put out for the first cut. So look, I don't think there'll be any harm in people to look at reducing that 80 units of the chemical nitrogen, maybe possibly back to 60. And in the meantime, they'll also be armed with the knowledge they'll have by getting their grasses tested for nitrates, see where they're actually at this time of the year.
Yeah, and the one other thing I suppose as well to mention, that you mentioned low emission spreading, and look, it's a brilliant technology. It reduces our ammonia emissions, and it's something that we really have to consider. But the other thing, don't forget the old advice of low emission spreading can do so much for us, but we still should be spreading on those overcast, slightly misty days, because it does reduce that ammonia emissions, and ammonia is nitrogen. So to consider them all, the old good advice, I suppose.
No, absolutely. That hasn't changed at all. We've just changed the type of equipment, but the basics still apply.
So that's it, Pat. I think we covered a lot of stuff there, but the important thing to come out of here is a lot of testing. Use the tools we have available, I think. And the other thing to remember is that, look after our pits. The big message coming here from today is, we don't want effluent getting into our water, into our rivers. In actual fact, a farm that I worked on a good few years ago when I was doing farm management, we got effluent ran into our well water. So that was an absolute disaster trying to get it out of the well water. So it's important to get those cracks fixed up, make our channels correct, and make sure the effluent's going to the right places. So thank you very much, Pat, today.
And just the last thing, Cathal, was just to remind farmers about the buffer zones that exist for spreading slurry of 5 metres from water courses, and also chemical fertiliser 2 metres. So they shouldn't be forgotten about in the whole package as well.
Thanks, Pat.
Thanks for your time.
That's it for this episode of the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast. Thanks to Pat Moylan, Teagasc Dairy Advisor in Kilkenny, for joining us on the show. And if you would like any further information on nitrogen use efficiency, listen back to podcast 1.
Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Cathal Summers.
And I'm Deirdre Glynn.
Join us next time for the Teagasc Environment Edge podcast, signpost to farm sustainability.